Tonight you'll sleep in a room with your door shut, in your own bed, somewhere people can't come without your permission. Most people think this is what sleeping looks like, that people have always had some sort of private space in which to rest, to think, and to exist without being observed. That's not exactly right. For about 300,000 years, no human being on this planet had a private room. There were no doors to close, no walls to retreat behind, no moment in the day when you were not within arm's reach of several other people. The private bedroom is not an ancient human institution. Until the 1900s, it was not a common practice. Everything you think of as personal space, solitude, and physical privacy is, in the whole history of human beings, a recent invention that barely registers. And that's what makes this really worth knowing. Privacy was in no short supply for early humans. They weren't pining for walls that had not yet been invented. They had a more subtle art than mere physical separation for dealing with life in a group where all was shared and nothing was hidden. They made something that was invisible. It was all upon social agreement, and it worked so well for so long that most people living inside never felt the need for anything else. Understanding how they did, it tells us something important, not just about the past, but about why so many modern people have all the privacy they could ever want and still feel profoundly, persistently alone. Humans lived in small groups, between 15 and 50, for about 300,000 years. You weren't just related to everybody around you. You were right there beside them, almost all of every day. There were no walls in hunter-gatherer camps, no separate rooms, no designated private spaces of any kind. You huddled close to others for warmth as the temperature dropped at night and body heat became a resource for survival. You sat by the same fire and you ate. There were conversations that everyone in the camp could hear because there was no other physical space to have them. If you were mad at somebody, the whole group knew in a matter of minutes. If you got sick, everybody saw it. You didn't need telling if you were grieving. This was not seen as a problem. It was just the way human life was. It had been the way it was for so long that there was no pattern for picturing it differently. The idea that you had to be alone, physically apart from other people in order to feel comfortable, safe, just didn't work in the way ancient human identity was constructed. Archaeological evidence always supports this. Shelters at sites like Ohala II in Israel, some dating to around 23,000 years ago, are barely big enough for a family to lie down in together. The people had nowhere to sleep. There was no place in the camp where one could go where he could reasonably expect to be unseen and unheard. The group was not a group of individuals who sometimes came together. Everything was shared by default. The group was the fundamental unit of existence. The individual was meaningful only within it. When most people learn how ancient humans lived, the obvious question they immediately land on is, if everybody was always right there, always within earshot, always aware of everything that was happening around them, how did couples ever get any privacy at all? Anthropologists who have studied modern hunter-gatherer communities have documented 3 consistent strategies that emerge in totally different cultures and locations. This suggests these patterns are not cultural inventions, but something more like universal human problem-solving. The first was the timing. Most intimate moments took place at night, when darkness provided psychological cover, even when physical separation did not exist. Everyone around here was either asleep or knew they should be. Darkness was a wall, such as no wall could provide. The second strategy was to stay distant. Couples would move away from the middle of the camp, but not far, because it was dangerous to leave the firelight completely and go into predator territory, but far enough that they were no longer right next to everybody else. 50 feet in pitch black is pretty much invisible. The third strategy was the most important one, and it is the mechanism that made ancient privacy really work. Social graces. All of us agreed together to ignore certain things, while knowing full well what they were. When there was no physical space available, you gave people psychological space. You glanced away. You kept your mind to yourself. This was not some vague cultural norm. It was a working social technology, a mutual agreement that made invisible boundaries where no physical ones could, and it held together the whole structure of group life for hundreds of thousands of years. This is the part that truly requires a change of perspective to understand. Modern humans have a desire for privacy that ancient humans may not have had. Not that they were less developed or less sophisticated, but because their entire psychological relationship to solitude was based on an entirely different foundation. Anthropologist Colin Turnbull lived for years among the Mbuti of Central Africa, one of the most studied hunting and gathering societies in the history of anthropology. He said something that is hard for most people to stomach today. The Mbuti had no word for privacy, not because nobody had considered the idea yet, but because the feeling of having to be alone was utterly alien to their self-understanding and their lives. That makes a lot of sense when you think about what being alone really meant for most of human history. It was not easy to break away from the group. It was no restorative. It was dangerous in a real, tangible sense. Predators moved past the firelight. Humans who strayed too far from the group did not always come back. Solitude was not a luxury primitive man could not afford. It was a condition they actively avoided, for it was truly linked with death. The modern need for privacy, psychologist Erich Fromm argued, is a product of individualism, a relatively new cultural phenomenon whereby personal identity is developed independently rather than through group membership. The ancient human being's identity was purely relational. You were your role in the tribe. You were your connections. Aloneness doesn't give you space to find yourself. It robbed the self of the context in which it existed. It wasn't something ancient humans were taking time off from. It was who they were. There are two activities that to us modern humans seem more private than almost any others: sleeping and using the toilet. Both of these occurred in ancient human communities with no physical separation at all, and both were managed by the same social technology that managed everything else. Old camps meant close contact of bodies in sleep, not side by side at a comfortable distance, but really pressed together for warmth, with an arm across your back and somebody else's feet near your head. Archaeological evidence is consistent across sites from many continents and many time periods. The notion of a single sleeping space is so new that in medieval Europe it was normal for whole families to share a single bed, and no one thought this odd or uncomfortable as a modern person would instinctively do. The bathroom situation was managed by a combination of designated location and willful ignorance. If a person had to leave the camp for this purpose, they walked to a designated spot downwind of the living area. Everyone knew what that gate meant, and all agreed together not to follow, not to watch, not to recognize it when they came back. There was no physical privacy, but social privacy did exist. It was purely created through mutual agreement to redirect attention. This pattern shows up in modern life more than people think. Public toilets are shared spaces where a number of strangers are doing the same thing, fully aware of each other, and yet a working social protocol makes the experience manageable. That protocol was created by ancient humans and used in all their lives, not just in certain rooms. Much later, the walls. The agreement was the first. About 10,000 years ago, people in the Fertile Crescent began farming, and farming needed something that hunter-gatherer life never needed: durability. You could not plant crops and then follow herds of animals across the land. You had to stay long enough to tend, harvest, and store what you grew. To stay put was to build things to last. Walls meant structures that lasted, for the first time in history. The wall changed everything about the way humans related to each other and to themselves. Now, for the first time, one could stand in a space that people could not look into without permission. For the first time, there was a physical line between your life and the lives of the people around you. The door was more than a piece of architecture. It was a psychological upheaval. But even then, privacy was a privilege, not a standard. Only the rich had separate rooms in which to sleep. For much of human history, most people still lived in single-room homes where the whole family shared the same space for everything. The expectation that children should have their own bedrooms was not a common one in Western societies until the 20th century. It is a development so recent that many people alive today grew up without it. The notion that privacy is a right that everyone enjoys, a baseline expectation of daily life, not a luxury for the few, is not some ancient human value that civilization finally delivered. This is a product of modernity, an extension of agriculture, an improvement over industrialization, and so rapidly normalized that most people cannot imagine living life without something that their ancestors were completely without. When you put it all together, honestly, this is what it all points to. For 300,000 years, humans lived packed up against each other, aware of each other's every mood and movement, without walls to hide behind or doors to close. And by any measure at the disposal of researchers, those humans were not suffering the arrangement. Their social bonds went deeper. They felt more in it. They had an identity rooted in something bigger than themselves that no bad day or tough season could take away. Next, we built walls. We got rooms. We have doors that lock and spaces that are just ours. We got the capacity to go a whole day without no meaningful contact with another human being, and we called that progress. Researchers say loneliness is now one of the most serious public health challenges of the modern world. But for most of human history, the loneliness epidemic was not a thing. It is not because ancient humans were better people or lived simple lives, but because the physical structure of their existence made true isolation almost impossible. When 20 people are sleeping 5 feet away from you, You can't be invisible. We built walls to escape from the discomfort of living together all the time. And what we discovered on the other side was not the peace we sought. We found quiet rooms and empty evenings, and the strange, specific ache of being surrounded by more people than any human ancestors ever encountered, and somehow feeling more alone than any of them ever were. Humans were never quite alone for 290,000 years. Then we invented walls, and we have been alone ever since.